Hello again, everybody, and God be with you. So, I'm going to read another story from Bob Hartman's More Bible Tales. I'm not going to tell you initially which part of the Bible it's from or where it's set. See if you can work it out as we go through the story. It's called the Councillor's version. The woman and her son walked tentatively into the tent. They looked around nervously and finally sat themselves down. Music was playing softly in the background, some kind of whistle or pipe, the woman thought. And then, after a few moments, the councillor pulled back the tent flap and joined them. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Arthasad?" he asked, glancing at his clay appointment tablet. Mrs. Arthasad sighed. "It's Obel, my son, here. We don't seem to be able to communicate anymore." The councillor looked at the boy, and Obel just grunted, lowered his shaggy head, and rested his chin on his chest. "And how long has this been going on?" asked the councillor. "Oh, not long at all," said Mrs. Arthasad. "Well, since just yesterday, in fact, when he turned 13. "I see," the councillor smiled, leaning back and making a little tent shape with his fingers. "Since he became a teenager, in other words. Well, it's not uncommon, Mrs. Arthasad. I see a lot of this. One day a bright and happy boy, and the next day, well, we can see for ourselves." Obel grunted, and his mum shook her head. "I don't think it's as simple as that," she replied. "I think there's more to it. I really do. Raging hormones, teenage angst, the sudden eruption of spots. I should think that's reason enough, Mrs. Arthasad." And he peeped at his hourglass. "But we do have quite a bit of sand left, if you want to tell me what you think the reason is." "I think it has to do with something that happened at work," she replied. Nodded the councillor. "And what do you think, Obel?" And Obel just grunted and shrugged. "I'm not sure if that's a yes or a no," said the councillor. "My problem exactly," Mrs. Arthasad replied. "And it's even worse when he speaks. I can't understand a thing he says." The councillor smiled once more. "Again, not an unusual problem, Mrs. Arthasad. Teenagers have always had their own special phrases. Groovy. Slip me some skin. Yes, well, I think it's more than the odd word," the woman insisted. "As I said, it all seemed to have started at work." "Yes," the councillor interrupted. "So you said. So why don't you tell me exactly what happened?" And then he paused, irritated. "Do you think that music's a little loud?" he asked. "Well, now that you mention it, yes," Mrs. Arthasad replied. So the councillor reached back and pulled a flap aside. "A tad quieter, Peleg," he ordered the musician sitting there. And then he turned his attention back to his clients. "You were saying," he continued. Mrs. Arthasad shifted in her seat, collected herself, and began. "I run a little mobile snack bar at the big building site on the edge of the city." "Where they're putting up that new tower?" asked the councillor. "That's right," nodded Mrs. Arthasad. "And Obel here comes in and gives me a hand after school. He makes the drinks and does the washing up, and it provides him with a bit of pocket money. Well, if I do say so myself, we have built up a bit of a reputation. Bacon rolls in the morning, freshly prepared sandwiches at lunch, and all our cakes are homemade." "Sounds very nice," the councillor noted. "It is," smiled Mrs. Arthurshad. "So much so that we had a visit from Mr. Shinnar himself, the man in charge of building the tower." "Very impressive," nodded the councillor, and then he held up his hand and pulled back the tent flap again. "Peleg," he shouted, "I told you to keep it down." The councillor turned back around, but the musician just shrugged and kept on playing. "Musicians," he sighed, "temperamental. You were saying." Mrs. Arthurshad leaned forward, grinning. "I was saying that Mr. Shinnar himself came to visit our little snack bar. Ogle made him a lovely cup of tea, and he had one of my cheese scones. Then, when he took the time to compliment me on my cookery skills, I summoned up all the courage and asked him how he thought the tower was going. Well, it was like a proper conversation, like he'd known me for ages. 'Oh, Mrs. Arthurshad,' he said. Knew me by name, he did. 'Oh, Mrs. Arthurshad, the tower project is going well beyond all expectations. We intend to make a reputation for ourselves, we do. We're using bricks instead of stone. We're using tar for mortar. Everyone's on the same page. Everyone's speaking the same language. And as a result, we believe that this tower will reach right to heaven and give God himself a bit of competition.'" Mrs. Arthurshad leaned forward even further. "To be honest," she whispered, "that last bit did make me a tad nervous. Right up to heaven? Makes you wonder what God would think." "Well, you'll have to ask a priest about that," the councillor grinned. "Not really my area, if you know what I mean. But what does any of this have to do with your son's lack of communication?" "I'm not exactly sure," said Mrs. Arthurshad. "It's just that the moment Mr. Shinnar left, it happened. I turned to Ogle and asked him to pass me a butter knife, and he just looked at me like he hadn't a clue in the world what I was on about. I asked him again, and that's when all the grunting and shrugging started." "So it happened immediately?" asked the councillor. "Just like that," Mrs. Arthurshad replied. "It was very strange." So the councillor turned again to the boy. "You need to help us here, Ogle. You really do. I understand how difficult it can be to make that transition from boy to young man. Why, I've been there myself. But you can see how distraught your mother is. Can you give us some tiny clue as to what's going on inside you, or how we might help?" And that's when the boy raised his shaggy head. He looked at the councillor, he looked at his mum, and then, very deliberately, he spoke. "We understand the way eagerly or say." The councillor looked worried. Can't make head nor tail of that. I see exactly what you mean." And then he paused. "Mind you, it would help if the music weren't playing and I could hear what was going on." And he opened the tent flap again. "For the last time, Peleg," he shouted, "could you keep the music down?" Once again the musician shrugged, but this time he put down his flute and he spoke. "We understand away, equal will say, or I don't say." The councillor turned white as a sheet. "Did you hear that?" he cried. "Whatever's going on with your son seems to have affected Peleg as well." Mrs. Arthurshad put her hands to her face in horror. "You don't suppose it's catching?" she asked. But Ogle was jumping up and down, delighted, and pointing at the musician. The councillor pointed as well, first at Peleg and then to his mouth. And then, speaking as loudly as he could, he asked the boy, "Do you understand him?" "He's not deaf," complained Mrs. Arthurshad, as the boy kept hopping and nodding and pointing. "Well, I'm taking that as a yes," replied the councillor. And that means we've got some kind of strange language affliction thing going on here. Something well beyond my expertise. I think we need a specialist. And he opened a different flap and called for his receptionist. Miss Joptan, I need you to get in touch with Dr. Haddaram immediately. But the receptionist just stuck her head through the flap, a confused look on her face. "Che?" she answered. "No comprendo." "Right then," said the councillor, leaping from his seat and collecting his things. "Time for me to go now, Mrs. Officer. Pleased to have met you. Sorry I couldn't have been more help. All the best to you and your son. Arrivederci." And shocked, he put his hand over his mouth and raced out of the tent and down the street. Mrs. Arthur followed, with Ogle and Peleg in tow, chatting away to each other. There was chaos everywhere. Everyone jibber-jabbering to each other with words they could not understand. And rising high into the sky in the middle of it all stood the tower, half finished. Mrs. Arthur looked up at the tower and beyond it to the clouds. Competing with God himself, she wondered. Then she turned to her son and gestured. "Let's go," and she waved for him to bring Peleg along. "Might as well get some food into you," she said, pretending to shove something into her mouth. Oval looked at Peleg. "Into say," he grinned. Yea," Peleg replied. And they headed for their snack bar in the shadow of the tower as everyone babbled around them. Well, not one of the most familiar of stories, but have you worked out where it was? In the town of Babel. And the story was written in Genesis chapter 11. And the story is how the people at that time living in Babel thought they could do better than God, and they were going to build a tower all the way to heaven. And that apparently was when God decided that he'd cause a little bit of confusion and he would introduce different languages into the world. So whereas some people communicate with other people, very few people could communicate with everybody. Well, there you are. That's Miss Week's story. Stay healthy, and I'll see you next week. God bless you.